Hello and welcome for the two in this short video for class 20 for Introduction to Philosophy. So today's stuff is all about ethics, specifically utilitarianism. As I mentioned in the last short video, kind of the two big dogs of ethics are utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, or put, a little harsher, the ends justify the means. And the other view is deontology, specifically rule deontology, which if we put it in bumper sticker terms would be obey the correct moral rules. So there are two videos of Mill's utilitarianism, part 1, part 2, and super quickly the idea is this. So Mill's view is that the principle of utility is the correct moral view, and that is the principle that actions are right, are good, in proportion as they maximize happiness, and they're bad to the degree, morally wrong to the degree they maximize unhappiness. And he defines happiness as pleasure in the absence of pain, and unhappiness is the opposite, pain in the absence of pleasure. And so right away he runs into the pig objection, which goes way back. Aristotle was aware of this objection. And the idea basically is we take pleasure to be the highest good. That's morally terrible because it makes people be like pigs. And Mill tries to solve that pig problem. Now, Mill's principle of utility also, of course, has to address the question of scope. Who counts? So in terms of what is utility, what is a value, happiness is positive value, and pain is negative value. And the only things that have intrinsic value are pleasure, positive value, and pain, negative value. Everything else is purely extrinsic value. It's merely assessed in terms of what kind of pain or what kind of pleasure it produces. Now, Mill, of course, also has to address the question of who counts, the scope of morality. And Mill is super generous. He says pretty much everybody, anything that's part of sentient creation that feels pleasure and pain. And this does make sense because pleasure good, pain bad. Now, one of the obvious challenges is if you ask people, hey, does your pain and pleasure matter to you? Most people will say, yes, it does. Then the question is, how do you get this applied to everybody? Because Mill's view is, in terms of the scope, really broad. And he presents an argument trying to argue for this, covered in Utilitarianism Part 2. And so, quick sum of utilitarianism, again, the idea is that for Mill, an action is good to the degree that it creates happiness, pleasure, no pain, and bad to the degree it creates unhappiness, pain, not pleasure. And then essentially everybody and everything that can feel pleasure and pain pretty much counts. Now, utilitarianism, of course, popular and appealing. But obviously, if it was like the correct moral view, I'd just say, hey, we're all utilitarians, everyone else is wrong. But there are problems for it. Now, some of these are what I call internal problems. These are problems that are not designed to show that utilitarianism is mistaken. These are just things that if you're a utilitarian, you'd have to address and deal with. And again, these aren't trying to show utilitarianism is wrong. They're just questions that have to be addressed. And one of the biggest ones is also a kind of a practical problem. And it's the problem of basically, how do you divide up the value? So when you're figuring out, for the utilitarian, you're supposed to be maximizing happiness. And the question is, what are you trying to do? How are you trying to divide this up? And this is very similar, in fact, can be seen as the same problem as if you're looking at, say, the economy in a country like our country, the United States. If we're trying to if we say we're trying to have a good economy or strong economy, what do we mean by that? Who gets the stuff? How do we divide it up? And as you might imagine, you can have very different views of how the divisions should work. So if you're utilitarian, is it that, you should have a few who are exceptionally happy, and that's what you should do? Or should you have lots and lots of people being, kind of mostly happy? Or obviously the ideal would be everyone being super happy, but there's a question of how you divide stuff up. Again, just like with the economy. Is the economy doing good if, say, a relatively small number of people are doing exceptionally well. Do you look at like, well, we got billionaires and potentially some trillionaires. Is that a good thing? Is that how we should divide up the stuff? So utilitarianism have to address that question. Morally, how do we divide up the stuff? And utilitarians, just like people in politics and economics, disagree about how you should do this, how you should divide it up. Utilitarians also run into an internal problem about how do you do the calculation? Do you, because anything you do can have consequences that go on to infinity and beyond. Something that occurred, 100 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago, or thousands of years ago, can still have implications today. And for example, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, you can still trace back things that are occurring today back to that. And so there's a question of, when you're doing stuff, how far ahead do you have to worry, and how do you even know? So some problems. Now, there are also problems that are aimed at critics of utilitarianism, trying to show that utilitarianism is flawed or not correct. So these are kind of like attacks on utilitarianism. And of course, even if you're a utilitarian, these are things you'd have to address to show like, hey, those attacks really don't work, perhaps. One of probably the most famous ones is the idea that since utilitarianism is about the consequences, it would seem that this moral theory would allow there to be like terrible things done to a small number of people, provided that those terrible things created lots of, happiness or positive value for everyone else. And that's a point of concern. Some people think that the book, or the story, Those Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin, is a story about this problem. Other people, including the author herself, seem to somewhat disagree. And so it's a, classic problem. And there are many other problems for utilitarianism as well. So utilitarianism, one of the big dogs of ethics, it's got some problems, because of course it does. So that's the content for this class. As always, the notes, readings, and paper guide, if you don't have them already, available for download. And the coursework is Quiz 22, Million Utilitarianism. And like all the quiz, it's got the due date. It's also got the available until, which in this case is the same because we're in the part 4, the end of the course. And 5 points, 5 questions, 5 minutes. And of course, to take the quiz. So that's the stuff for this class day. Again, as always, you can do the class at your own pace. Just be sure to complete this stuff by the available until dates, because that's when they're no longer available. And also, grades are due. And perhaps most important and practically, I have a normal 9-month contract. In the summer, I have a 3-month, I have a 6-week contract, not even 3 months. And then at the end of 6 weeks, no more pay. So I also, of course, the grades are due, but also, no more pay, grades due, etc. So essentially it ends when it ends. So have a good rest of the day, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.